This is a presentation of the book, Gender Quotas in the Post-Communist World, Voice of the Parliamentarians, edited by Joshua Dubrow and Adrianna Zabrzewska of the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences. This book was funded by the National Science Center, Poland, and published by Evispan Publishers. By post-communist world, we mean countries in Europe or the former Soviet Union that endured generations of Communist Party rule. This is an edited source book. The focus is on how parliamentarians argue for and against gender quotas. It begins with general information about women's political inequality in national parliaments in the communist and post-communist world, and about the social science literature on gender quota policy. It continues with translated documents and surveys of parliamentarians on gender quotas in Poland and an interview with a scholar activist here. It ends with an analysis of parliamentarian arguments. The book is free, costs nothing to download, and you can download it right now. We had two main motivations for the book, but they're both based on a single situation: the unreasonably slow and uneven progress of women in politics within and across post-communist states. First, we briefly present the situation of women's political representation in national parliaments and gender quotas as a policy. This information is in the book. When looking at the long term, there are two main things to note. One, across over 70 years, not one country of the communist or post-communist world achieved the gender parity level of 50%, and all are below 40%. After the fall of communism, in every country, the percentage of women in parliament dropped. After 1989, the trajectory of women's inclusion in parliament varies. It is not necessarily linear or upward. In all, it is slow, taking many elections to even get past 20%. As a solution, many countries turn to gender quotas. In its political sense, gender quotas are policies that aim to provide opportunities for women to be in parliament or to appear on candidate lists in elections for political office. There are three main policy types. There are reserved seats, and this is a set percentage or seat allocation for women, and it's relatively rare. There are also legislative or electoral law gender quotas. These are mandated by law about the form, implementation, and maybe enforcement of the quota. And there are voluntary party quotas, which were really popular in Eastern Europe in the 2000s. Political parties adopt quotas within their own party organization, but are not compelled by a national law of any kind to do so. We address three main questions about quotas in the social science literature. One is how to implement gender quotas. The paths to implementation vary by type of quota and the political and social context of the quota push. Paths are forged, in part, by women's activist organizations, international pressure and transnational diffusion, and party ideology and party pragmatism. Parties may ideologically align with the idea of women's equality, or they don't and are simply seeking votes. Are quotas effective in placing women in parliament? Yes, but they may not attain the percentages set in the policy, and intersectionality matters, as gender quotas tend to put ethnic majority women in parliament. Do quotas have other effects? Yes. Quotas, by placing more women in places of power, lead to changes in parliaments and parties, to new legislation that benefits women, and to the transformation of the society in general. Indeed, the recent literature, especially about Western Europe, is about quotas in corporations, board of directors, and so on. Across the post-communist world, gender quotas are popular, but not necessarily as a legislated gender quota at the national level. Next, we turn to the second motivation of the book. We argue that the unreasonably slow and uneven progress of women in politics within and across post-communist states is not well understood. We lack some basic information in English to understand countries of the region that share a historical context. By understand, we mean the push for gender quotas in each country. Who pushes? What are the obstacles and points of resistance? What are the country-specific problems that they face? And for successful attempts, how did it happen and what lessons can be learned? This was our frustration with writing and editing Chapter 3, in which we sought information about electoral law gender quotas for 29 countries of the post-communist world. We had difficulty finding up-to-date information in English for all countries. We believe that the post-communist world is understudied, especially in comparison to the West. This is seen in some ways. First, we wanted to view the landscape of English language articles in the social sciences on gender quotas in general and the post-communist world in particular. This landscape can be roughly mapped in bibliographic databases. In the Web of Science, we put gender quota in the topic and returns 742 items. Most of those are articles. We wanted to know how many of these items mention specific countries of Western Europe versus how many of the post-communist world. We searched within these 742 items. We counted all items that specifically mentioned 12 West European countries, including Sweden, France, Spain, Germany, Belgium, and others. And we counted all items that specifically mentioned 28 post-communist countries. We find that output about the West is bigger than that of the post-communist world. Output is uneven within the post-communist world. Poland has the most. Now, word search items are important, as where we perform the search. The Web of Science does not bring up informative but lower visibility outlets that present research on women in politics, such as Analyze, Journal of Gender and Feminist Studies, edited by the Romanian Society for Feminist Analyses, and free books such as Gendering Democratic Backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, a Comparative Agenda. Second, we examined the two major cross-national databases, IDEA Quota Database and CARET. They're both helpful, but they are not detailed enough to achieve what we call the understanding. The IDEA Gender Quota Database only includes those countries that have some sort of quota, and thus we do not know anything about the push for quotas. They have quota information for 17 post-communist countries. CARET has every country in the world going back to 1947, but because of the data they collected, they only have information on whether they have a quota or not, and if so, what kind. They also have % women in lower house of parliament. CARET data ends in 2015. They are very useful for cross-national quantitative research, but they do not provide the qualitative details to understand how quotas were or were not implemented. Indeed, in cross-national quantitative studies, the post-communist world is just one of many variables, where 1 equals this historical context and 0 equals otherwise. These models can be helpful to discover that the post-communist experience matters, but like all such variables, it is an insensitive and simplifying measure. We created a source book as a call for attention to the problem of the need for more information about gender and politics in the post-communist world. The book is in 2 parts. The first part is cross-national. The second part deals specifically with Poland. We present historical and current information about how parliamentarians think about quotas. Our source book has a few innovations. One is a sequence of graphs to trace and compare patterns of women's representation in 30 countries over 73 years. Another is a chapter on the state of gender quotas in 79 post-communist countries. Using a variety of sources, this chapter presents which countries adopted national-level legislated gender quotas and which did not. In the case of countries that have no gender quotas whatsoever, this chapter reports attempts that have been made at introducing quotas. Now, research on all 29 countries is limited by the paucity of English language scholarship on these countries. Several chapters contain Polish parliamentarian statements about gender quotas from the 1990s to the early 2010s from interviews and surveys. The 1990s text is translated from a book of interviews with Polish parliamentarians. It's from a study led by Jacek Kryczewski and Małgorzata Fuszara. The 2000s and 2010s are based on 2 surveys of Polish parliamentarians, 2005 and 2011. 2005 was a web survey, and 2011 was a mix of web and paper and pencil survey. We put the methodological details in the appendix. The surveys included open-ended statements. We put these open-ended statements from parliamentarians in the appendices as well. We also include, for the first time anywhere, an English language translation of the entire parliamentarian debate in Poland's Sejm on the proposed gender quota law in 2010 that was signed into law in 2011. This is a long chapter, 110 pages, and it is a useful resource for scholars of the English language world on gender quotas in Poland. It also includes an interview with Małgorzata Fuszara, who is a prominent academic and longtime advocate of women's inclusion in politics, and who successfully presented the case for gender quotas in that same debate. The interview is about the state of Polish women's inclusion in politics today and about the ongoing fight for LGBTQ+ rights. There's also an analysis of Polish parliamentarian statements on gender quotas by Adrianna Zabrzewska. This was a presentation of the book on gender quotas in the post-communist world, Voice of the Parliamentarians. This book is free to download at politicalinequality.org/genderquotas.